Let's see how data travels through Splunk. And what I mean with this is, where is the data picked up and how is it processed along the way until we can search for it. So if we want to divide the stages the data is taking through our Splunk components, four certain phases emerge. The first phase we have a look at is input phase. In input phase, we define which data sources we want to monitor for changes. And then if something changed, if new data came in, we add a bunch of metadata onto it, for example, on which host was this collected. And then we ship the data to the next instance, to the next phase. The phase after input phase is the parsing phase. This is where we want to find the event boundaries. So imagine a huge, like a text file is coming in. The question is every single line an event, or are multiple lines an event? For which characters are we searching for to split up the stream of data into dedicated events? What also happens in this phase is everything around time zones. And additional features of the parsing phase are something like data manipulation. So if you want to mask, for example, a user account or IP address, this is also happening in the parsing phase. The next phase is the indexing phase, and this is where we extract tokens. What I mean with token is certain segments of characters and numbers that make sense for us to search later on. For example, if you take an IP address again, the octets itself would be for dedicated tokens. So this allows us to store then the tokens in the index. And the index allows us to look up those tokens. Let's say I want to look up Thomas, and then I can find in the index where the data is stored. So there's a pointer to the raw data, so we can find the data very fast and we don't have to extract all the data, parse all the data. We can look in the index to find where our data is located. And of course, this only works if the data is also stored somewhere. So in the indexing phase, the data is stored in a kind of raw format on disk. So we are not transforming anything into databases. We are not storing something like JSON documents. We're storing the raw data. And finally, we reach the search phase. And this is where we are extracting our fields. So let's say an event contains something like a username or IP address. We probably want to search for this later on with something like user equals Thomas. And this happens at search time in Splunk. The other thing that happens is field enrichment. So let's say we have a file where users are mapped to different departments where they work in. And now we want to look up if an event contains something like user equals Thomas. We want to create a field that is named department, and that allows us to further search and filter the events. And of course, we don't only want to search in the events, we want to do something with the data. So we want to calculate statistics and compare different values. We want to see trends. We want to create visualizations. We want to see outliers. All things like that happen also in search phase. So we learned about the four phases that every data input is going when we send it through our Splunk. And we learned before about the components that make up such a Splunk environment. So let's see if we can map these two together. Let's take an example, a file-based input. So imagine something like var log auth log on a Linux server, and we want to ship this to Splunk, and we want to search for who logged on to this machine in the last 2 hours or something like that. So if we have the file-based input, we configure this as an input on our universal forwarder, right? We install the universal forwarder on the Linux server, and we configure the universal forwarder to have a look at this text file. And if something gets added to it, then the UF is realizing this and is shipping the new data to our Splunk. So it's the universal forwarder here that tags on a little bit of metadata, and this is of course happening during input phase. So input phase is happening here on the forwarder, on the universal forwarder, and then we ship it to our next component, right? And this is the indexer. So the indexer is then doing the heavy lifting. It is trying to find the event boundaries. Is really every line every single line in this log file a new event, or are there some multi-line events? How is the time zone set for this input? Does Splunk have to calculate something around the time zones? And of course, also if we would mask some data, if we would do something like that, this would also happen here. And what also happens on the indexer here is indexing. So we try to find our search terms, our tokens in the text file, in the event that we just recognized, and we map this to the raw data that we also store on the disk. So right now, everything we need to be done to be able to search in the data is already done, right? The data is on the disk. The index is filled with our search terms, and everything is nice and tidy on the indexer. So parsing and indexing happens here. And of course, as I said, we want to search in the data. So finally we reach search phase, and this happens on the search head here. So everything is already in place. The search head only has to connect to the indexer and tells it, yeah, I'm searching for var log auth log, and I'm searching for events from the last 2 hours. Please return the events to me. And then the indexer says, okay, I'm searching in my data here, and I'm returning the results to you, dear search head. So this is how the 4 phases are aligned in an example with something like a text-based input and a universal forwarder shipping data to the indexer. So this is kind of the, I don't want to say normal, but like 80-90% of most deployments. Have to be careful here because there are really exotic environments as well. But this is kind of the default use case, right? The normal thing to happen. Okay, let's have a look at another example then. So if we have some other input, something like a data source, that is more involved, something like the database, SQL database or NoSQL database, or an API, maybe somewhere in the cloud. And we want to Splunk the data coming from there. We want to ingest the data from there. So what we need here is a heavy forwarder, because universal forwarders are really stripped down. They don't have the full feature set, and there are a lot of features we probably need here. Something like the integrated Python interpreter, or maybe something like Java compatibilities to access databases, stuff like that. So what we are doing is we're using a heavy forwarder, and since a heavy forwarder is already a full-blown, full-featured Splunk Enterprise instance, it already takes over a lot of the phases for us. The rule of thumb you can follow here is that the first Splunk Enterprise instance, the first really full-featured Splunk Enterprise instance that is receiving the data, is doing the parsing and the indexing. So in this case, the input phase happens on the heavy forwarder because we're configuring the heavy forwarder to monitor this SQL table or something like that for us, right? But since it is already a Splunk Enterprise instance, the heavy forwarder is doing the parsing and the indexing for us as well. So the question now is, so now we have the data already in a ready to go format, right? We could already search for it. What should we do now? Should we leave it on the heavy forwarder? And the answer is no. We want to send the data to the indexer still, because the indexer is the place where we search for our data, right? How should the search head know that the data is now residing on the heavy forwarder? This is not something we want to do. Also, when it comes to disk space or something like that, the indexers probably have the huge disks. The heavy forwarder mostly has a little bit of buffer or something to like. So we are sending the data to the indexer, but this time it is already pre-processed data. That's why I made this arrow kind of a little bit thicker. This should indicate that this is not only the raw data that is flowing to the indexer, this is also the index itself, a lot of metadata. So this is more data than if we would just send the raw version of it, right? And the indexer is accepting the data. It is not doing really anything with it in terms of processing. It is just storing on the disk. So it's kind of, yeah, thanks heavy forwarder for doing all the heavy lifting for me. I just take this and store it on disk and leave it as it is. So the indexer is not really involved in any certain phase here, just with storing the data on the disk somewhere. And then, of course, as usual, we have our search phase, and this is happening on the search head, as nearly always. We are connecting with the search head here to the indexer and trying to fetch some results, right? We are saying, yeah, we search for everything regarding this API that happened in the last 5 minutes, and that contains, I don't know, this IP address, and the indexer is returning the results to the search head.